Welcome to the deep dive. We hear this phrase all the time, right? The cost of living crisis. It often sounds like this big, unavoidable global thing. But what if there's more to it? What if it's less about just costs rising and more about, well, specific decisions, policy choices? Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're getting into a really interesting analysis of what's happening in Australia's economy. An article that argues these challenges, they're not abstract forces. They're actually direct results of the paths taken.
Yeah, what's really striking about this piece is how it reframes things. It pushes us away from just thinking, oh, everything's expensive, towards looking at, well, the system itself, policy. The core argument, basically, is that Australia's living standards aren't just under pressure, they're in crisis because of specific policy failures. Things like too much government spending, maybe unchecked money creation, money printing, housing strategies is clearly not working, and a real decline in industries that actually make things. And the article is really emphatic about this. These are presented as preventable issues, not just bad luck or something inevitable. That's a big difference.
Absolutely. A preventable crisis. That's a strong claim. And that's really our mission for this deep dive, to explore the specifics, the evidence the article uses, and yeah, the pretty bold solutions it puts forward. We want to give you a clearer, maybe more nuanced picture of what's actually going on in Australia and why it matters, not just for Australians, obviously, but maybe as a case study, how policy choices play out in real life. So where do we start? Let's begin with something incredibly relatable, unfortunately. The rise in homelessness and housing stress. It's quite shocking. This analysis points to a really stark statistic. By late 2024, an extra 10,000 Australians were becoming homeless. Every single month.
Every month.
Yeah, that's apparently a 22% jump in just 3 years. It's staggering. And the really striking thing is who this is affecting. It's not just, the usual demographics you might think of. We're talking essential workers, nurses, teachers, people struggling to find stable housing. And the article connects this directly. It says this isn't just some isolated problem. It's tied fundamentally to housing demand just exploding while housing supply is, well, collapsing.
And we dig into that supply-demand issue, especially population growth. The numbers are pretty eye-opening. The analysis highlights net overseas migration running really high, around 500,000 new migrants coming in each year. Now, it's really important to understand how the article frames this. It presents it purely as an economic variable, right? Not as a social or race issue. The focus is just on the sheer numbers and the pressure on housing. Demand is just massively outstripping supply.
Just pure logistics and numbers.
Exactly. And the prediction is pretty grim. Australia is projected to be short almost 393,000 homes by 2029. So it really begs the question, doesn't it? Why aren't enough homes being built to keep up? What's the holdup?
Yeah, what is the holdup? And that question, according to this analysis, leads straight to government policy and bureaucracy, red tape. The source points out that greenfield land releases, it's basically new land opened up for housing, they're still way below the long-term average.
Still lagging behind.
Yeah. And on top of that, you've got restrictive planning rules, layers of bureaucracy, just making it really hard for new developments to get started, let alone finished quickly. It's painted as a problem at multiple levels, local, state, federal governments, all kind of contributing to this slowdown in getting housing approved and built. Like, the system can't keep pace. But it's not just about the physical houses, is it? The article ties this housing pressure cooker very tightly to how money itself works in the economy. It points a really significant finger at money creation, currency debasement. Specifically, the Reserve Bank of Australia's, the RBA's, aggressive quantitative easing. Now, that's basically the central bank creating new money digitally to buy up bonds and things, injecting cash into the system,
Right.
flooding the market. Exactly. And they added almost $280 billion to the economy in a pretty short window. And the consequence, well, the article argues this huge expansion of the money supply watered down the value of the money already out there. It eroded the purchasing power of ordinary Australians. So, real wealth loss, especially because wages weren't really keeping up, right? They stayed pretty flat for many.
So more money chasing the same amount of stuff.
Pretty much. Your savings suddenly buy less. That's the core idea.
And that money creation, the article argues, doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's directly linked to government spending levels that it calls unsustainable. It mentions that in the previous year, public spending topped $1 trillion. That's quite a number.
$1 trillion. Wow.
Yeah. And interestingly, the RBA itself, the central bank, actually identified excessive public spending as one of the key things driving inflation, along with the surge of money supply we just talked about.
Sure.
So this leads to a really powerful claim in the article.
Inflation, it says, isn't the fault of everyday people tightening their belts or spending too much. It argues it's actually an outcome of decisions made by government and the central bank, policy-driven.
Okay.
So if
Yeah.
you connect those dots, it means that financial pressure you might be feeling, it isn't necessarily about, your grocery bill going up because you bought too much avocado toast.
Right.
It's potentially about these much bigger systemic choices being made.
Which then makes you look at the other side of the government coin, taxes. And the numbers here are frankly astonishing. The analysis says there are 125 different taxes in Australia.
125.
Yeah. I mean, everything. Income tax, obviously, Medicare levy, GST, stamp duty. It even mentions taxes on taxes, like the excise tax on fuel, which already includes GST. And here's the kicker, according to the source. Despite this huge tax take and all that money creation we mentioned, the public services and the infrastructure that taxes are supposed to pay for, they're described as deteriorating. So families are stretched, basic needs aren't being met properly. It kind of questions that whole social contract, doesn't it? High taxes, but what are we getting for it? And then there's the longer term picture, looking at what the economy actually produces. The article highlights a really significant decline in real production in industry. It gives this statistic. Manufacturing, as a share of the whole economy of GDP, has dropped by 2/3 over 40 years.
2/3.
Yeah. It's now apparently the lowest share among all OECD countries.
Lowest in the developed world, basically.
Pretty much. And the consequence is clear. Australia now imports most manufactured goods. We've lost jobs, skills, a degree of self-reliance. The analysis argues that this heavy focus on just services and digging minerals out of the ground has left the country, well, vulnerable. Vulnerable to shocks from overseas and increasingly reliant on just taxes, debt, and, more money printing to keep things going.
So if we try to pull together what the analysis calls the root causes, and again, it really stresses these are policy failures, not just things that happened, it paints a picture of a toxic mix. That mix includes rapid population growth from immigration hitting inadequate infrastructure and housing. Add to that excessive government spending funded partly by
Money creation.
exactly currency debasement. And then layer on top a really high tax burden. What's really, I think, insightful or at least central to the argument is the insistence that this isn't just a series of unfortunate events playing out. It's presented as the direct result of specific decisions, choices made by policymakers over time.
Okay, so if that's the diagnosis of the problems, really rooted in policy, what about the cure? The article proposes some pretty direct solutions, framed as responses to those specific failures. First off, it calls for a sharp curb on government spending and borrowing. Basically, end the stimulus binge, stop spending on things that don't boost long-term productivity, focus on, essential productive infrastructure, not just endless welfare or politically driven projects, as the article puts it.
Right, fiscal discipline.
Exactly. Second, and this is likely to be controversial, it suggests a pragmatic pause on immigration.
Okay.
But it's very careful to frame this. It explicitly states it's not an anti-immigration stance in principle. It's about practicality.
About capacity.
Precisely. The argument is get the housing, the infrastructure, the services in place first. Make sure you can actually accommodate people properly before increasing the population further. Sequence it correctly.
Makes sense from a logistical standpoint as presented.
That's next. Third is tackling that housing supply bottleneck head-on. Accelerate land release, slash the red tape, get rid of restrictive zoning rules, basically make it much easier and faster for the private sector to actually build the homes needed. Incentivize it.
Okay, so streamline the building process.
Fourth, there's a call to actually rebuild Australian industry, to reinvigorate manufacturing and innovation.
Bring back making things.
Yeah. Through things like targeted tax breaks, ensuring stable and affordable energy, which is a whole other topic, but crucial, and maybe strategically protecting some critical industries so the country isn't so reliant on imports for essential goods. Build genuine economic output again.
And the fifth solution. This one's quite forward-thinking, maybe even radical, depending on your view.
Definitely. The fifth proposal is to adopt a sound, decentralized currency. The article specifically suggests moving away from traditional fiat currency that's money-backed only by government decree and trust.
Like the Aussie dollar, the US dollar.
Exactly. Moving away from that towards a hard currency, and it explicitly mentions Bitcoin.
Bitcoin.
The argument presented is that something like Bitcoin has a mathematically fixed supply. It can't just be printed or created without limit by politicians or central banks.
Right, unlike fiat money.
So the theory goes this imposes discipline on government spending because they can't just inflate the currency to pay bills. It prevents that hidden tax of inflation caused by debasement. It's a bold idea, proposing Bitcoin as a monetary anchor. Of course, the whole world of digital currencies is complex and debated, but that's the solution offered here.
It is bold. And to tie it all together, the article uses this really vivid metaphor, doesn't it?
Yeah, the house metaphor.
Right. It pictures Australia as a house that's had way too many people move in, but nobody's actually built enough extra rooms or upgraded the plumbing. It's powerful because it shifts the focus. The problem isn't who is moving in. It's that the house, it's the economy, the infrastructure hasn't been managed or expanded properly to cope. It's about foresight and capacity management.
A really clear image. And that leads into the conclusion of the analysis, which is pretty stark. It offers a serious warning and a call to action. It basically says, look, without these kinds of major reforms, reining in spending, getting immigration and housing in sync, rebuilding industry, adopting sound money, Australia risks heading down a path towards recession, rising poverty, even social breakdown. Serious stuff. So it ends with this appeal, an appeal for Australians to wake up, really understand the root causes, demand change, and importantly, reject the narrative that their struggles are just inevitable fallout from global trends. Instead, see them as consequences of potentially fixable, policy-driven mistakes. It's a direct challenge.
Yeah, it really is. I think, a key takeaway from digging into this source is that perspective shift. Understanding how some of the biggest challenges we face are being framed here not as these unavoidable forces of nature, like bad weather, but as the direct results of specific human-made policy choices. That fundamentally changes how you might think about responsibility, and maybe more importantly, where you might look for solutions. It puts the power, potentially, back into the realm of policy debate and public demand.
Absolutely. It shifts the agency, doesn't it? And that really leaves us with a final thought, something for you to maybe mull over. Given what we've unpacked from this analysis, if the major challenges facing a country like Australia really are, as this source argues, policy failures rather than just inevitable trends, what does that truly suggest about the power we might have collectively to demand accountability, to push for different choices? Something to think about. Until our next deep dive.